Oh, see, we're all still learning new things. Yes, you will have access to the recording, Cesar, for sure. So we want to start by using the whiteboard tool just to warm you up on Zoom, get you going. And we want to start our conversation here really trying to get in the shoes of our students and get your perceptions of how you think your students are doing in this remote environment. So in order to use the whiteboard, you need to go to this view options icon right at the top of your screen. You should have a drop-down menu that allows you to annotate. And if you see that, you can either draw on the whiteboard or use the text box to type, or you can also use the chat. So you're welcome to post any comments you have in the chat. You get to that by using the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. So how do you think it's going for your students? Struggling? Mm-hmm. Hello.
I know, I'm sharing the actual whiteboard tool. So you can just have a white slide like we did, modeling different things, or we can have an actual whiteboard tool. And you can type things too. And so we want to also give everyone a chance to practice different tools, some good. I'm not saying that handwriting is hard to read. I am saying that there is a text tool that will let you type a response if you want.
I'm always amazed at people who can draw with the cursor. Yeah, some good, some not. Yep. Definitely bummed to be missing out on the social and just regular experience of college for sure. My 20-year-old is at home looking like that sad face at the moment. Okay, but that's after they already met me live for the first half of the semester with Swarthmore. Yeah, so if they had the advantage of already meeting you, then maybe they made that connection already, and that made it a little bit easier to go virtual. Meh, yeah. So so thank you for that. And what we thought we would do is share with you some data that's actually been collected. Oh, that's great, about a graduation ceremony. I'm also planning on doing that. So I'd love to, who wrote that?
Al, I did.
Oh yeah, so Al, I'd love to touch base with you at some point about what you're planning because we're brainstorming.
I haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, exactly. I'm doing the same. Okay, next slide, Shauna. So we want to share with you.
Sorry, since this is a workshop, I asked, does anybody else have a problem with things they type disappearing and then something appearing in Chinese?
Oh, is that what was going on with the Chinese?
Yes, so I
wasn't sure about that.
I typed it
Didn't know if that was intentional.
And then something weird happened, like ET was there, the rest was gone, something in Chinese was there. I tried again, and the same thing happened.
I don't know. I've never seen that before.
But did you see it?
Yeah. And Kristen also is having some issues. So, Zoom is buggy. And I'm not an expert, but definitely these are things that you have to practice to see, what comes up when you do try these things. So yeah, I'm not sure why that was happening. I always go back to Google when in doubt. Okay, so yeah, next slide, Shauna. Yeah, so we just want to, of course, acknowledge that this is a very challenging environment for everybody. Shauna found this on the New Yorker, and I've since become addicted to New Yorker cartoons because they're hilarious. But we're trying hard, right? We're trying to put our heads down, get through this the best of our ability while all of this chaos is going on around us. And when we think about this for our students, we're the experts, right? But then we have our students who are also trying to learn these new concepts, scientific concepts that are complex, that are hard and challenging, along with all of their academic goals and aspirations, along with all the chaos and trauma that's going on around them, right? So this is a particularly challenging environment for them as well as us. And so what we wanted to do is give you a little bit of a sense of what the data that's been collected so far about what students are saying about their experience. Next slide, please. Yeah. So actually, before I get into the data, just to give you an outline of where we're going today, we're going to talk first about the lessons learned from spring, including that student's perspective. We're going to really think about how to move away from the emergency response that we've had so far toward really intentionally thinking about how to design and improve our courses. We're going to frame this with 4 overarching principles about how to transition to remote teaching, which we're going to ask you to interact with each other and think about, and how to design for engagement and the different approaches that we have to do that, specifically synchronous versus asynchronous approaches. And then we also will get to talking about more equitable assessments, which I know is a hot topic that we're all concerned about. And then have you think about some next steps to developing your course. Next slide. Okay, so to dig into some data, go ahead, you can put the next slide up, Shauna. There was a survey that hopefully you were familiar with and sent out to your students. You can still do this, called the UC Undergrad Experiences Survey, the UQs. It went out to all UC undergrads. We have some preliminary results that were as of May 13th. And the response rate for UCLA students was around 3,000 students. A third of those students happen to be life science students. So, you know, this data is definitely somewhat representative of our life science students. I want to definitely emphasize the caveat that these are self-reported student perceptions of their learning, and that has limitations, of course, doesn't always translate to how they're actually learning, but we want to give you a sense of their experience and their perception of their experience in this environment. So not surprisingly, students are most concerned about how they're learning and how they're performing in their classes, how they're doing in their grades and the testing, and what is their performance, as well as how much they're learning. And so they were asked specifically how they thought they were learning more or less in specific environments, like lab environments, where they felt like they were definitely learning less. And then they had a slight preference for recorded lectures rather than the live Zoom lectures. They reported, slightly more of them reported learning more from the recordings. The majority did say that they are planning on returning in the fall, so that is good news. And I'm looking at Kristen's question, most concerned about learning as opposed to what? Yes, we're going to get to questions about finances and health in just a minute. So this is just focused right now on their learning in the classroom. So one of the messages that came across really strongly is that students are definitely not aware of the work that's happening behind the scenes to support their learning. So what faculty are actually doing to really help support their learning. And this is very informative for us, right, in terms of how we're messaging to students and aligning our expectations with theirs. There's definitely, we think there's been this disconnect between faculty expecting students to be able to go on with this in the same way they would in in-person classrooms, so with the same expectations, and that, you know, is not serving the purpose of the students who really are trying and not understanding that there is, you know, feeling the faculty are not understanding that there's this real difference in how they're learning in the remote environment. So helping them understand what the effort is that we're making, I think, can help with that disconnect. Next slide. So to get to Kristen's point, we found the survey found that 40% of our students have additional family care responsibilities, which we thought was huge, right? If we think about the added cognitive load that's going into learning, right? They're also thinking about having to take care of their family as a big part of what they're doing. And then 54% reported that they feel very concerned about feeling socially isolated. 18% reported that they're very concerned about their basic needs, and that does include financial issues and other types of very basic needs, food, etc. They did disaggregate this data by group, and they found that the majority of students reporting that they're very concerned about basic needs were in the group of students who are Pell Grant recipients, first gen, or transfer students. And then actually more students who are concerned about feeling socially isolated tend to be the more privileged students. So just to get a sense of this sort of disproportionate and this inequity that's being emphasized in this particular environment. They also talked about feeling their perceptions that remote learning is harder than in-person learning. And again, I just want to make sure that we don't make the assumption here that that necessarily, means that that they're not learning as well in the remote environment. That it doesn't necessarily mean that that environment is not being effective, but it's their perception of the remote learning environment that they feel like is harder. So being harder doesn't necessarily mean ineffective. Next slide. Great. And so these are just some open-ended responses. They reveal that, again, there is a concern with the quality of instruction, worrying about their mental health, worrying that professors aren't being empathic and understanding where they're coming from. But there were some positives. So they did feel that they're getting timely feedback, that there was good communication around expectations, that faculty were being flexible and responsive, and that students appreciated those recorded lectures and also appreciated working in smaller groups when they were able to. So
I have to ask,
yeah,
the worry about mental health, is that their mental health or our mental health?
They're worried about their mental health. I think they're also worried that we're not worried about their mental health.
Right.
So I think both things were conveyed by this. There also is a perception that they're doing more work, and this is something that we want to address directly with how we're designing our courses, because we do need to hold them accountable, and because especially in the asynchronous environment, which we'll talk about, that can feel like a lot of busy work. That can feel like there's a lot of extra stuff that's going into holding them accountable that we wouldn't have to do if they just had to show up in the classroom. So we want to make sure those expectations are really clear and that they know up front that there's a reason why we're asking them to do the things that we're asking them to do. Any questions so far or other comments about these data? Cool.
I was just wondering.
Yeah, go ahead, Ella.
I was just wondering, how often they bring up the issue of not having, the resources that they need or the private space that they need to participate in remote learning, especially synchronous lectures.
Yep. That definitely came up as one of the things that they were worried about. Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you, Shauna.
The learning effectively in the remote instruction environment was one of the highest things they were concerned about, which gets a little bit at it. We will share this report with you so you can dive into the data all you want, but that was the second highest kind of concern.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to follow up on what Al asked, anecdotally, what % of the students don't have privacy when they're in class?
Yeah. So, Donna, do you want to share some of the data that
I was thinking of Jeff Malloy's experience because he has an N of 300.
Yeah. So
there's an instructor who teaches a first-year course with about 300 life science majors. And he asks them to come to like 4 hours of synchronous sessions a week, which is a lot and not necessarily what we'd recommend, just to let you know. But he had them contact him if they couldn't make it and couldn't turn on their video and engage due to privacy or bandwidth concerns. And it sounds like it was around 20. Around
20%?
No.
20 people?
20. Yeah.
Okay.
20 people. But we want to be cautious. We're not sure to what extent students were feeling pressured to need to go places in order to do that. But that's the only data we have.
I asked the question too in my 200 student lecture, and about 10% reported that. So.
With the same ratio, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so these are the things that we want to think about. We're trying to find the best solution regarding this tension between wanting to be accessible, but also wanting students to be able to engage, right? So how are we going to be able to take into account all those variables and make decisions, the best decisions that we can, to serve our students and serve as
I
many.
had a professor tell me that for this course they're teaching this summer, they plan to give synchronous exams during the regularly scheduled class time. And they were contacted by students saying, well, I'm taking your class and another class that meet at exactly the same time, which of course is something that normally would be impossible. And so that sparked a discussion in our department. Well, that shouldn't be allowed. And, I don't know. I mean, so
Yeah.
it's interesting
Yep.
issues that come up. Yeah.
Yep. And I think that, one of the things we're going to focus on is the flexibility issue and being
Yeah.
flexible on both individually, maybe on the individual level, but also on the departmental level, how we can kind of think about that. Okay, so I want to hand this over to Jess.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right, great. So we've been talking a little bit about this difference between this emergency response and moving toward an improved online experience. And so, it might, especially in the winter quarter for sure, and the spring quarter, it might have felt like this first image of this really, you just got to do what you got to do, and it's clunky and it's difficult and it's challenging. And UCLA, but just generally to frame this within the context of higher education across our nation right now, is being very careful in how we're distinguishing the kind of emergency remote teaching that's been happening as compared to a fully developed online course experience. And part of the reason for that is that, unfortunately, the perception is that because of the experiences of the past couple of months, that online learning isn't good. It's horrible. You have to stare at a Zoom meeting every couple of hours, and we really also want to make that distinction here and talk about what a fully developed online course looks like, but also acknowledge that we want to meet you where you're at, right? So summer session's coming up very quickly, and it's a very condensed timeline. I know one person said they are teaching an intensive 3-week long class. So that's a different scenario than perhaps stretched out over a semester that you're not teaching until the fall and you have more time to plan. So we want to meet you where you're at, but we also want to understand that there are some benefits to incorporating some of the best practices for a fully developed online course as much as possible. And so when I'm talking about that, some of the things that I'm thinking about are, so in a fully developed online course, which were you to develop one, you'd probably have a lot of support and resources, and it would take at least probably 6 months or so to work with a team and develop some of these things. So that's not the expectation here, but just want to frame the context. So you'd have a variety of learning objects. So material would be presented in different ways, in text and video and audio. And you might use some educational tools to have some interaction, provide students feedback, and also be thinking a lot about accessibility as you're building those types of learning objects for your students. Another part of having a fully developed online course is that there's a lot of attention to detail and thought about how you're organizing your course within a learning management system. So very explicit instructions about when everything is due, and rubrics and clear information for students, so that there's no question about what they should be doing or how to go about it. And related to that is also the pacing is very thoughtful and consistent and transparent. So things like the due dates and the assignment details, students would know those far in advance so that they would be able to meet deadlines, and there would be some consistency. So things would likely be due at the same time to prevent any confusion or missed deadlines or that sort of thing. In terms of asynchronous, so the things that students would be doing offline, there would be a lot of thought towards how can students not just be, reading a textbook and doing some quizzes, but also doing things where they're engaging with each other, where they're engaging with the instructor and the TAs in that offline space. And there would be attention to also building some relationship building that could happen offline without the live session. And then when it comes to online courses that do incorporate a live session, it would be very targeted and structured to make sure that it's the best use of that time together, right? So if I host a Zoom meeting for my students and I just lecture for an hour and they don't ask any questions and there's no interaction, that probably could have been a recording that they could have watched. So that's not the best use of live time, right? There's other ways that you could use that time to connect with students and allow for some practice and feedback. So what I wanted to, I'd love to hear from you all now, if you've had experience teaching a fully online course before, or if there was something that you tried out recently with this remote teaching experience that has worked well for you, or something that you want to try. And I know we have Gaston here, so I might put you on the spot, Gaston, because I know you've spent a lot of time trying to make some of the activities students do offline more interactive. So I don't know if you want to share some of the strategies that you've done.
So, so at the beginning, I was focused on equity and tried to have a really low stake. Like I didn't want to do Zoom, I wanted to do chat, which is text-based. So, thinking, well, maybe some students don't have a phone, or, just chatting it's a low bandwidth, so you don't need a lot of wireless, capabilities. So I started with that. And then as I also had LAs, and there was nothing to do for the LAs. So everybody would just sit at this chat window and students would drop in and out, and it was asynchronous. And then, so sometimes there were too many students to really process it. And then sometimes there was nobody. And I scheduled 9 hours every day. So after 2 weeks of that, I decided to start with Zoom and chat. So I offered both. And then I had a split. So I had students who liked the Zoom and then students who liked the chat. But it was still asynchronous. So then the engagement was, it was also not structured, right? So the TAs would just sit there and the students would come in and that you have a question. And then students would just come in for a question and then pop out, so there was no working together. So then in the third week, I started Synchronous Sessions. So I had students sign up for it, and I have 700 students, 250 signed up, and then only like maybe 150 showed up. And then in the Synchronous Session, I really structured it. I had like a worksheet and had the TAs, and then some TAs were confused. So then some TAs treated it still like, oh, what's your question? And of course, that didn't really work well, but it did work well in the sessions where the TAs really just, had the students, and if you were late, you were late, and they had breakout rooms. And so then that worked actually best. However, right, so only 100 students, so they are consistently showing up for these because they're not required. And so my thought for summer is that I will require 1.5 hours of synchronous session. And then I deal with the students who can't do it, right? So if there's some students in Hong Kong who can't do it, then I might do it at midnight. Or what I learned another Zoom meeting with instructors, do one at 8 a.m. and one at 8 p.m. So that should cover all time zones. Versus designing the whole course really open and flexible, because it's open and flexible and they don't have to show up for the synchronous session. There's only like 100 students who are really participating right now. So it's good for these 100 students, but it's really not really helping all the other students. So that's my experience. And then what was it? I'm just looking at the slide.
I know you've done a lot of work with the H5P and put like embedding
How's
questions, video,
that?
that sort of thing too.
Well, then, so the online stuff I'm using Labster right now, which is virtual laboratories. And then for some of my worksheets, I do have online worksheets, basically, where students go online and then we work through that worksheet guided, and it's step by step. And then they can work through that worksheet either in the synchronous session with the TA, so they all have it up and then work on it together, or they, the other 700 students basically work on it at home and then use discussion boards and the LAs on the discussion boards to get through these worksheets. So they are pretty complicated, these worksheets. So when they're not going into synchronous sessions, then there's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And then also I agree with lectures. So I have webinars at the beginning, and at the beginning maybe 200 students showed up, and then I recorded and posted. And at the beginning there was a mixture of background lecture versus just announcements. And so for summer I decided to just do an announcement live, where I just say, this is what you're going to do this week, these are the deadlines. But I don't give any background information. The background information goes into these online lectures. And then also what I've been doing, I'm cutting out all the ums and ahs and pauses. And it makes it really fast. I mean, it's just like, but then they can slow it down and they can stop. But that made videos which were like 40 minutes, like 20 minutes, just by doing that. And what I'm trying to, so at some point I thought, well, other people are doing that too. So there are online tools to do that automatically. But I don't have it yet. So to run
I was going to say, that's a lot of work, all of the little
It sounds like a tremendous amount of work.
Yeah, but there's automatic where you set when there's a pause in certain milliseconds, and then it will just cut out the video. But then means when I do a video, I can't have these long pauses where I show things, because that will be cut out, right? So I'm just trying to streamline my process, right? So I give a lot of background information, but I don't do a lot of pausing and showing things. And then I could automatically remove these. And then it makes it very fast. And I think it keeps the attention span of the students better.
Well, for those who don't know, Gaston teaches very, very large classes. So he's also got a lot of experience working with the TAs. But a couple of things you pointed out, and the learning assistants, a couple of things you pointed out that I just want to highlight is that iterative nature of trying something, and if it doesn't work, adjusting it, and for the next week, trying something different. And just, thinking about what's the best use of that live time and recording things and posting them. So
what you already said is the deadlines, I have 10 labs, so the deadlines are all the same.
Yeah.
And I have one extra day always. So there's a hard deadline, and then I have a soft deadline, because there's always students who are late. And then either I give a penalty for that by the hour within that one day, or, they still have one day to submit, and then I lock it down.
Right. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on a little bit. We're going to have some discussions coming up about the asynchronous versus synchronous and the best use of time, and some ideas for tools that people might use. But I also want to make one more point, which is that, it might feel like this is a temporary situation. Is it really worth doing all this work? Aren't we going to go back to being a residential campus again? And I know you've all been following the news, and the reality is that we don't know, right? We don't know if this is going to continue, if there's going to be a second wave, if it's going to happen again in a year, if there's going to be another pandemic, God forbid. But we also have had situations like campus closing because of fires and air quality and that sort of thing. So we do know that what we do want to kind of reframe it as is just thinking about any efforts that you're making right now to really enhance this experience, which might include, designing some, sorry, somebody is, if everyone can mute, thanks. So if you're investing some time in some things that, like recording some videos, some mini lecturettes, or designing some worksheets that students can do at home, that sort of thing, we just want to plant the seed for you that those things are going to enhance the experience for the students this summer and this fall if you're teaching this fall, but it's also things that you can then utilize also when we do return to a residential campus, and provide you with some flexibility to go online when that might be needed. You hopefully will learn to use the learning management system a little bit better for organizing your course, and some of those strategies. You might try some new tools that you end up really like using. Maybe some of you will continue to use Zoom even when you're meeting with your students in person, or other tools. And also, if currently you do a more traditional lecture style when you're meeting with students in person, you might find that repurposing that live time to really make the most of it, some of those things you might want to transition into your in-person classes as well, because it might feel more engaging with the students, or like you're connecting with them more, and that they're getting more feedback from you when you're there live. Versus a more traditional lecture style. So these are all things that you're going to be trying out, and you're going to be investing time, but we want you to know that that time is not wasted, and that it should hopefully continue on into your courses. All right, is this Rachel now?
It is me. So we want to give you this framework when thinking about transitioning to the remote environment, which are these 4 overarching principles that we're borrowing from Karen Gosling from Yale University. And so next slide. So I'm going to go through these 4 principles with you, and then we're going to put you in breakout rooms and ask you to think about how to apply these principles in your own course design. So the first is really explicitly including time for reflecting. And that means both for yourself as well as for your students. And we talked a lot about, understanding where your students are coming from, and you can find out that information by surveying them before class. And so you get a sense of what the challenges are that they might be facing, and how you might be able to address those challenges. And having check-ins also will help you get feedback from them. So what's working for them, what isn't working for them, and that will also help you with this iterative process of how you might change things in order to address some of the needs that are, or some of the gaps that might be forming. Next one. The next is to be flexible. And so we've talked a lot about, thinking about how you can be flexible with different types of the way that you're going to offer assignments, for example, but also really being flexible in terms of the hardware, the internet, and the timing. And so the first piece is just showing them that you understand that there's all these uncertainties, and that things can happen without plan, wasn't in your plan, but it happens. Also giving multiple ways for them to participate, so having options that they can choose from, and then thinking ahead of time about what contingency plans you can put in place if something does go wrong. So just letting them know that you've thought that through, right? So if the internet crashes when they're in the middle of taking exam, this is what's going to happen, right? So you've already thought about it, you've given that information to them, so they can be relaxed, that knowing that even if the worst case scenario happens, it's going to be okay because you've thought it through. The third is about transparency and communication. And so really having much more frequent check-ins with your students can be very helpful. And so, it may feel like there's a lot of hand-holding that has to happen, more so than in the in-person environment, but that's because you're all out in cyberspace. And so the more you can show them that you're there, that you're accessible, that you're available, that came out in the surveys, that they appreciated knowing that that you were listening, that you were responsive. So that's a really important piece, is the communication, but also being transparent about where they stand in the class. So again, they're kind of out there, they're maybe floundering, they're insecure about how they're doing and how they're performing. So making sure that you and or your TAs are grading in a very timely manner, so that those grades are up, they're posted, and they know where they stand. And then you can also check in with those who are not participating, right? So if you see someone that is not responding, that there's no assignments handed in, you can reach out to them and say what's going on. And I found that when I've done that with my students, often throughout the class, I'm hearing the stories about what's going on with them. And so I'm learning a lot about what they are experiencing and the legitimate issues that are going on that are distracting them. And then this is probably one of the hardest pieces, is how do you build community among your students in the remote environment? And so while they appreciate the flexibility of being asynchronous and being able to do things on their own time, they are expressing that they miss these in-person connections. And so we're going to talk more about how to find ways to have them work together in groups, both online in a live way, but also asynchronously outside the normal class time, where you can help really explicitly make that happen. So you're not doing it in a passive way by suggesting that it should, but you're really explicitly offering, these are the ways in which that I expect you to be able to work together, and this is how I'm going to structure it to help you do that. Okay. So now we're going to have some time to practice a breakout session, so you all can learn about, if you haven't done this already, what it feels like to be in a breakout room. What we've done is created a Google Sheet that we'll share. Thank you, Shauna. She put the link in the chat, so everybody can open that Google Sheet now. This is something you can do with your students. You create the sheet ahead of time. And then you have them open it, and on the sheet you have explicit instructions of what is going to happen in those breakout sessions, because they cannot view your chat any longer once they move into that session. So on that Google Sheet, you'll see the 4 principles that we just talked about, and the instructions, which is that one person in your group should be able to take notes based on your discussion, and you're going to enter those notes in the spreadsheet with your breakout number, your breakout group's number, and in each of these cells you'll put the responses of your group as they're discussing each of the principles. And so we just want you to talk about the principles, how you might incorporate strategies in your own courses. If you're already using some of these strategies, are there any challenges that have come up for you? And so when we get back, make sure you've assigned one person who will share with the rest of us. And we'll have about 8 minutes to do this activity. So does anyone have any questions? And we all will be there also. We'll each go into a room and help facilitate this. Okay, so Shauna's going to zoom you into rooms.
Oh, I'm in the psych department also.
Oh, what is your last name?
Weimer, Scott Weimer.
Oh, it's nice to meet you. I'm
Nice.
Ankowski, Amber Ankowski.
Nice to meet you, Amber Ankowski.
Hi. Oh.
I'm Andrew Ward. I lecture for the psych department every summer, but I'm at Swarthmore College during the rest of the year, and I collaborate with folks in the department. If you know Janet Tomiyama, she's a longtime collaborator in health psychology.
Oh,
Hi
okay.
everyone, my name is Deborah Jarrett. I'm a lecturer at UCLA for biochemistry and chemistry courses.
Welcome. Welcome. I did not mean for this to be the psych group, so that just shows how much.
You're being analyzed.
Okay, well, welcome. Well, you all can start deciding on who would like to take notes in the Google Doc, who would like to share with the main room.
I'm multitasking. I don't know if I'm the best person.
I'm not a good note taker, but I could share with the main room if you'd like.
Okay, I'll take notes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Great, and then you can all just share any ideas you have for any of these principles, trying to cover them all, or notice which ones are harder for you.
For me, let me just say, for me, technology is difficult. I get easily frustrated. I'm of the older generation, so I wasn't born into this. I don't know how to do this stuff, and I find it very difficult. Once I've mastered it, it's fun, but learning it can be very frustrating for me.
Right. So in a way, I mean, relating to the principles, that could be that term of like being flexible. You know, often being flexible means using multiple technologies or multiple things. And so that might be challenging, and you can find other ways to be flexible if that's a challenging way. Or I guess in reflecting, you're recognizing what the challenges will be. But Andrew put it in a good spot. Can everybody see the Google Doc that we're looking at?
Yeah.
Yeah? How about you, Scott?
I can see it, but not at the same time as I see all of you.
Oh.
I have to go
Got it.
back and forth.
You're going back and forth. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's a challenge to get it all in there.
If I share this screen, can you see both at the same time?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. There
How
we go.
did you do that, by the way?
I'm sharing my screen. So in terms of
Oh, the bottom?
yeah, do you see that? You can all,
Yes.
if you want to practice sharing, you can. But it's a way of, I know that then it appears to you as if you see the 4 people on one side and then the screen in the middle, so you can see both.
Yeah.
Now, I have a technical question. How did you put us in breakout groups? And is there a way for people to choose who they want to be in groups with?
Right. The breakout room option appears when you're a host. So one of the recommendations we make is find 3 friends and practice switching off who's the host so that you can play with the breakout room function, because you can't play with it as a participant.
Okay.
In terms of letting people choose, you can upload CSVs of breakout rooms, if that makes sense. So you can have
What's a CSV?
Comma separated something. Basically a spreadsheet. You can create a spreadsheet based on their choices and then upload that to Zoom, and it'll automatically create breakout rooms. But given the, you can always manually create breakout rooms based on a list they provide to you. That might be the easiest way. So first get the list, and then whenever you create a breakout room, it'll ask you to automatically do it or manually. And so it'll either randomly assign or manually you can just move people into the rooms. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
Sure.
Hi, can everyone
sorry.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I was thinking about wanting to incorporate, I guess, task number 3, being transparent and communicating my expectations to the students. So I feel as though that's extremely important, and especially at this time where there may be confusion with the course taking it online. So definitely being transparent is essential for students to understand what are my expectations for the course, what are my expectations for them, and then somewhat asking them what do they expect from the course as well.
Right, that's great. Do you already have ways you want to communicate that, or do you are you asking for?
No, so definitely. So the ways that I would communicate that would be through the Zoom synchronous meetings. I like the idea of check-ins with the students, possibly having a survey before the course starts as to what are their expectations. Definitely discussing, I guess in a traditional way, the syllabus as well, but then I like the 2-week check-ins. How's the course going? What are their feedback so far? Possibly having a survey online or so a Google Doc survey in order to assess that information.
Great, great. And we'll be sharing a remote teaching checklist at the end that'll also have templates of what you just said, like a pre-quarter survey to find out about their technology, access to zones, and some ideas of like a mid-quarter feedback survey that's been created already as a CCLE template that you can just import into your course. With a 7-minute video that walks you through the exact steps, so that folks like Scott might be, it might be like, it'll just show you with your mouse what you want to do. So that's great. That's great. Deb, was it Deb?
Deborah.
Deborah. So that's great, Deborah, that you're thinking of that. That's key.
I guess for me, I'm most concerned with, I know I want to do number 4, but although it's easy for me to like sort of wrap my mind around how I can do asynchronous lectures and maybe like weekly sort of like journal type responses to course material. The whole thing of building in working together in a way that's not like a high stakes group project thing is sort of eluding me right now.
Right. Okay. So anybody else have ideas?
Yeah, I'd also love to hear ideas about that, because it's basically a lecture course where students normally would interact during the discussion sections with the TA, which I hope will still happen.
Mm-hmm.
But students would sort of organically form study groups. I remember when we were live, and so I'd love to figure out how I could maybe still have that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I can share what I do in live teaching, in-person teaching, which is I teach organizational psychology, and it's very, very, very interactive. So I will constantly put people in groups and give them a particular task, and it can be very open-ended. Like, what's your experience with poor communication in organizations? And I'll have them work in groups for a certain number of minutes, and then I'll call on each group and get them to share their experience.
I'm going to build on the example Scott just gave, and I'll just share. So in my role, I get to work with 30 different courses that all had to move to remote teaching because I have learning assistants. And the goal of learning assistants is to facilitate exactly the type of discussion Scott's talking about in section. And so I have a wealth of ways in which we have failed and succeeded this quarter. And so things for like what Scott said, if you had those questions in your section and had students in breakout rooms discussing them, that's one way to build community, because students are in the breakout rooms, they're talking about these questions. The challenges are if students don't have to hand anything in at the end of that section, most of them leave off their cameras and mics. They're kind of like, what, like, sure, I'll show up, maybe, or maybe I'll even get a point for showing up. But I'd rather just do this in my own time at 2 a.m. than at 2 p.m. when I have to sign up for my section. So we're learning more and more that if you really want students to engage with each other, giving them something to get done during that engagement is really helpful. And yeah, Andrew?
Oh, are these learning assistants, are they undergraduates?
They are, yeah.
I think I had a student write to me and asked to be one of these for the first time, and I had never heard of this program before, so that's really good to know.
Yeah, that's okay. If you're teaching this summer and want them, let me know. We're getting to the wire and getting them. But the idea is that we're also learning, even with TAs, breakout rooms can work, and especially if you have a spreadsheet like this that students are working on, the TA can monitor it and be like, I got to go to room 3. They are not, they're not getting through these questions. So we're developing and finding all sorts of ways of monitoring what's happening in the breakout rooms when we can't physically listen in and see who's working on stuff.
Is that true that you can't physically listen in?
You can, but there's this weird phenomenon that as soon as a TA or instructor pops into a breakout room, everyone's quiet.
That's true.
So it's that's the way, and it's awkward, and it takes a minute and everything takes longer. So this lets us monitor it. But hopefully, and the other option is to get at what Amber's saying. You don't have to have high stakes group things. You could also have low stakes group things where you say, in groups, you'll have a week in these groups to kind of do this like low stakes activity, find a time when you can meet, and that'll at least get them talking to one another and maybe forming more chances to form these study groups that Scott's talking about that might otherwise form.
So I don't have a discussion section. It's just the lecture portion.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if, like you said, find a time to meet. Maybe I can still, to some extent, form groups, and then they can figure out amongst themselves, and maybe then they use I don't know, maybe they post something on the discussion forum or something like that. But it's so logistically hard, especially with this idea of not expecting everyone to have connectivity, let alone at the same time, But right. I definitely want to try.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that it seems reasonable to have people, to allow that people can find times of connectivity, and otherwise use Google Docs. I think a lot of people can find those times. It's just they might not be available at that exact time you need them to be. Keeping that in mind. And then Google Docs are amazing. And so I think it's more if you set up the group project where there's some good accountability, and in this checklist that I share, there'll be some good tools for that, where they like have peer assessment before, you know, in the middle of the group project or something. They'll find a way to work together if you find ways to make it clear that there shouldn't be some person not doing any of the work. If that makes sense.
Okay.
I'm both moderating this discussion and making sure that everybody takes a minute to wrap it up. So let's take a minute to wrap up our discussion. Let's see where we've got this time for reflecting and being flexible. Any other ideas? The surveys can go, you know, making time to reflect on the survey feedback could go under that too from what you said. Anybody have ideas of how they want to be more flexible? Well, Amber, I guess, you know, Amber, your idea of making it so that they can meet up at their own times or somehow that's a way of being flexible.
I have a question actually about what we were talking about before,
Yeah.
which is how do we get people to turn on their videos so that they're interacting in real time?
Yeah, what we found this quarter is first it's hard, especially like, one thing is breakout rooms. I mean, like you all were pretty good, but a lot of people, Amber, right? You turned on your video as soon as we sent you to a breakout room, and then you bring people back, and sometimes they just don't turn it off. Like that's one way, but another way is sending a nice message saying we want to recognize each other once we're back on campus, you know, or in the fall you'll want to know who were the students in your class. So framing it in a way that's kind of nice for them. Like I want to know.
Can you give extra credit if they always have their video on?
I would have concerns about the students who don't have a webcam or who have too much going on in their background. You know, I think we have to think anytime we're giving points for that sort of thing, we need to think, how is that disadvantaging? Or is there an alternative extra credit for students that can't do that is all. So far instructors are more err on the side of like encouraging them. I've gotten to the point of saying, if you're not turning on your video, just let the TA know why, so that we're not going to push you anymore, but that way we can understand. I've got to bring us all back. This is a great discussion, but keep typing in the chat if any more come. Okay. So now you'll see that you have 30 seconds to come back. So if anybody was in the middle of a sentence, then they could finish their thought and we can go back. See y'all soon.
All right. Awesome. So thanks everybody for zooming in and zooming out. So we'll just go through and have each group, just in the interest of time, maybe give us one takeaway from one of the topics that you talked about. So let's start with group one. Who is that?
I don't think we decided on a reporter outer. Gaston, I'm going to make you do it. Want to pick one thing?
You're on mute.
All right. I'm trying to look at our sheet. There's something missing. So one thing which came up from L30 is if you have several offerings of a course, to merge these. So so they can maybe be all on the discussion board, on one big discussion board. Because the separation between the classes, if the content is exactly the same, the separation was really just in the lecture times, right? So then that could facilitate things. And then what I said is clear communication at the beginning. So basically saying, this is the expectation of this course. And then with that expectation, do a survey and see, you know, what students have and what they don't have. But for me, it's computer capabilities. And then deal with students individually, rather than doing the survey and then constructing your course around it. And then the expectation become kind of a moving target. And so I found that complicates things.
Not an anonymous survey.
Well, at the beginning of a class, it's anonymous, right? Yeah. And then one suggestion, which I liked actually, at the beginning of the breakout room, have students talk about some personal stuff, like what Netflix are you watching? I haven't even thought about that. I'm like always business, you know, like they come into, we get right to work. So I actually I like that personal touch to make it more personable.
Yeah.
But then you have to, how does it translate? I'm always wondering, you know, because I have to teach the TAs, and they might just be rote, you know, versus like what's your favorite animal, or you know, like I don't know, maybe a TA trainer can talk to that, you know, how to do it so that it doesn't really come over like this rote thing. It's actually a more genuine thing. But I like the idea.
Yeah, that was my idea. And one thing about it is I even use it in my in-person classes. Like I give people like a question at the beginning that's just like, talk amongst yourselves, you know, talk to your neighbor for 5 minutes about, you know, what's something you're looking forward to next week, or, you know, what's, you know, and just to get them talking, especially in small group classes. So.
Great. Okay, group number 2, Kristen?
Although where did
This was Scott. Scott, you had volunteered.
Oh, okay. Here's a technical question. How do we know if we're group number 2 or group number 1 or group number 3?
Oh, so the group that you were assigned to when you went into your breakout room is the group number. So you're actually group number 3.
We're 3. That was my bad. I'm sorry. I think
Okay.
You were breakout room number 3.
Did it say 3 somewhere?
It says it on the top of the bar when you go over the Zoom screen. If you're working on something else, or if you haven't like moved over that screen recently, it won't actually say it. It's weird.
Okay.
One thing I would suggest when doing this with your students is having them put their names in as which group they are. So if you're group 1, you go to breakout room 1, then you write down your names on the Google sheet. So it's very clear which people are in which group. But I think group 2 was our group.
Yeah, that was me.
So Kristen, go ahead.
So the thing that I was most interested in coming in, and we had a really good discussion about it, was about building community. And I talked about an idea I had of using GroupMe for communication. You can do person to person, you can do groups, you can do the whole class, which sounds really cool. The one concern is about FERPA, about sharing private information. So it's I have to figure out how to deal with that. I also liked Rachel actually requires students to come to office hours, like at least once per quarter, which I thought was really interesting. Credit first 2, hopefully they come, but not remote, so it didn't. Or I'm on a semester, so my semester started before your quarter did, but yeah, I definitely am looking for ideas on how to encourage or require study groups more.
Great. We're going to talk about things in a minute. All right, and group 3. Thanks, Kristen. Scott?
Okay, group 3. That was me, Andrew, Amber, Shauna, and one person who didn't have her video on, whose name I'm blanking on. Deborah, I think?
Yes. Deborah, yeah.
Okay, we talked about a bunch of stuff. I only remember some of it, to be honest. One of the things we talked about was using breakout groups to generate community and have people get to know each other. There was a question about what about people who, how do we get people to turn their video cameras on? And Shauna made a comment that there are some people who don't have video cameras and you don't want to disadvantage them. So you can't, if you give people extra credit for having their cameras on, you need to somehow give some alternative way for those who don't have cameras to get that same credit.
Yep. Great. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Shauna.
Okay. For this last bit, we're going to talk about more specific techniques of synchronous versus asynchronous, and then assessments. And I do want to point out, we started for those overarching principles because all of you make everyday decisions about your course. And so we want you to come at it from those principles, and we'll talk about now more specific things in which you can apply those principles. So as has come up, when you want to be flexible about everything, asynchronous is the most flexible, right? Students can do whatever they want on their own time. But if you want to build community, then you want synchronicity. You want to have people talking to each other and interacting. And it turns out that it really contributes to learning when students can construct their understanding with one another. So how do you balance these two things will be your challenge. We want to start by challenging you to think totally asynchronously. So most of our in-person teaching is synchronous. So let's start by thinking about ways to move all these components asynchronous, and then later you can decide which ones you want to keep asynchronous or make them synchronous. And so, well, you can type in the chat, you can raise your hand virtually or really to share what have you found successful in asynchronous sessions in the spring. We know about half of you have been teaching in the spring. So, oh, and you're seeing my whole screen. Okay, thanks. Let me just stop that. But anybody want to share what they're teaching asynchronously so far?
Al has a question or comment.
Al, okay. Oh, Al's raising his virtual hand. Thanks, Al, for modeling that. People can raise their hand. Yes, Al.
I just wanted to say that I actually was mostly synchronous, but I did have this. I did devote 1 2-hour lecture to students giving presentations, and the students were responsible for meeting outside of class to plan their group presentations, and it worked out really well. The quality of the presentations was fantastic, so that was a positive experience.
Yeah, and
They didn't resist. I was afraid they would say, "Oh, well, there's no time when we can all meet." They just did it basically. So yeah.
And Al, I love how you strike that balance of asynchronous while building community, because you don't force them to come to something. You don't require them to come to something every week necessarily, but you gave them a task by which they probably had to interact or meet somehow in order to achieve it. So I think that's great. Okay, I'm also seeing Tony said keep the videos short. Yes, yes. Sometimes we're like, it's up to you, you can decide, but the literature is very clear that shorter videos are better. 5 to 7 minute videos are better than your hour-long lectures. Amber, yeah, you like that students can watch pre-recorded lectures multiple times. A lot of students are loving that. And I think that's a good bonus. They also love that they can make it double time speed. Jane, you're getting to share high quality video lectures with good demos. Oh, that's great. Yeah, being able to have better demos is awesome when it's asynchronous and unrecorded. Kristen also is loving videos with lecturing with embedded questions like H5P, so interactive videos. Jane providing a way to ask questions. Kristen, discussion boards on specific topics, right? I like that idea of required initial posts and responses, so that students overcome the activation energy. Like, okay, this is where I post, and then start realizing they can keep posting and interact. That's a great idea. 2 people politely. Scott, do you want to share another
Sure.
thing you found successful?
I have a question about discussion boards. Actually, 2 questions. One, I haven't used them in the UCLA system, so how do you learn how to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question is, with discussion boards, do you grade people's participation, or do you just encourage them, or do you set a minimum requirement for how much participation, or what are your thoughts on that?
This is one where I'll say in general, it's up to you, but I'll share experiences. If faculty grade based on the number of posts, they get a lot of posts that are meaningless.
Right.
But if faculty grade the first post, they get a lot more people to engage and then let people take it over. CCLE does have a way where you're grading on the quality of the posts, where you can just like individually rate each post, and so their grade depends on the quality of their post, which I haven't personally done or seen others do, but there's a lot of documentation on doing that.
How about not grading them, just having it as an activity?
For faculty who don't make it worth any points, my understanding is it has much lower interaction, especially now that we've moved offline. Students don't know each other as well, and so then they're just interacting and they don't recognize each other's names. But there are things like Campus Wire. Campus Wire is one where you can upvote and downvote people and posts. No, you can't downvote people, but you can upvote people and posts, so people might engage in that more organically without any grades. But even when I compare two classes that have Campus Wire, the ones that assign some points to those first posts get more people engaged.
And follow up to that is, how many people in a class before it becomes too unwieldy to have a discussion board?
I have 700 students, but we have different discussion groups for different, so we have the one for the lab, and then one for like the final, and then one for the writing assignments. And there are different ones every week. So the topics stay within, and all 700 students are participating, and they're supposed to get a point for participating. The reality is, at the end of the course, I just give everybody a point. So I'm not gonna look through all these responses, but it's an incentive for them to go in like at the beginning, and then keep coming, and then they actually do have questions. They're not just gonna pretend at some point. And then there's weeks where it's not so complicated, so they might just go in to really show up. But then there's, where they really have questions. So I'm not gonna grade, even though I was told you can download and then look through the logs. I haven't done that yet. So I don't know what a real grading would look like for these.
Yeah, and hearing all these questions and comments, I think we're gonna, I see Al's comment too, there's so many different options for discussion boards. So maybe we at SEALS can try to collect all those options and have pros and cons about each one. That's a great idea, Al. For the CCLE, Introduction to CCLE, I'm about to put a link in the chat that CCLE folks created for teaching remotely and getting intro articles on teaching on CCLE. Jane, I think you've had your hand up and then down. Did you still want to share something, Jane? You're muted if you are sharing anything. Wanted to check in. Or raise your hand again if you want to share anything, Jane.
She said no.
Oh, okay. Okay, Al, is your hand still, are you still going to share something?
No,
Okay.
I forgot to lower my hand.
I got it.
There we go.
Great. Okay, so these are all great ideas. What we want to get you all to think about doing now is, while modeling another technique, is thinking about moving to asynchronous. And so I'm going to ask Jess or Rachel to put in the chat this link to another Google Doc. And we want you to think about all these different normal activities you would do in a synchronous class, and how could you have students do that asynchronously. So if you can all click on the link in the chat, you can open it up. And this works for, around 20 people. If you have more than that, this is a little harder. But you can start typing in here, indicating an idea you have. Like, let's say you wanted students to work on a worksheet together. How could you do that asynchronously? Right, Kristen's adding short recorded videos. If you see something here and you're not sure how to do it, you can write "not sure" and then we can talk about it. But we want to get you all practicing thinking how to convert things to asynchronous. Great. So yeah, how to use a poll. This is great. I love that this lets people anonymously ask questions as well. So there's a poll function in Zoom that I'll model pretty soon, actually, for another thing. But you can only see it when you're the host, so you won't see it as a participant. Some people also use polling on Poll Everywhere. And there is a UCLA tool called the Online Polling Tool that has, there's no perfect things, and we should also make a pros and cons list of the different polling tools. Yes, Al, I can already hear it. But you'll see there's multiple ways to poll, and it's a great thing to do during synchronous sessions if you're having them. But asynchronously, Poll Everywhere is great. CCLE has a choice tool, has multiple tools for that. I'm looking and seeing this having students discuss a question or solve a problem in small groups or pairs. It seems like that's a little bit hard for people to think about it asynchronously, as long as the individual writing activity or having students present. And so I can see people trying to edit at the same time. But yeah, a Google Doc is a great way to have students work together, or slides, right, if you have diagrams. Individual writing, CCLE has lots of writing tools. Having students present, I want to put a plug-in based on just talking to some students who had their presentation go horribly because it was a synchronous student presentation and their Wi-Fi cut out and they were so nervous about it, and then they got a question and then their Wi-Fi cut out again. So I'm gonna be a real fan of like pre-recorded student presentations and then interact on a discussion forum or something else. So have students ask and answer questions there. So because students are already super anxious about these presentations. For those of you, we have you try to think of your own activities here, but I do want to let you know that if you scroll down, there's an answer key, but there's ideas. I have to compare your ideas to the ideas that we have with links of how to do each of these if you want to be able to do them on in your class. Now I'm going to bring us back so that another resource, if you're getting excited about these interactive 5 to 7 minute lectures, there's this online teaching toolkit, and they have a nice PDF that gives you an outline of how to make these micro lectures. And you might think you don't want to waste your time doing that, but these will be handy even when we go back to in-person teaching for your students to watch maybe before your class or before section or something like that. So these micro lectures can come in really handy. I want to point out from that UQ survey, something that Rachel was talking about. Where are the biggest decreases in the quality of environment for students? There's a lot of data here, but what I want to highlight is that my feelings of loneliness and the amount of interaction with other students in classes and the quality of interactions, those are all the ones that have gotten much worse the most. So that's why we really, one of the reasons we emphasize this building community aspect is help foster that interaction when and how you can. Okay, so when and how do you want to use this synchronous time to build community? Really when useful interaction is happening. And so our number one thing is providing alternatives, right? So that you can be flexible for that 10% of students that would find it hard. Which you can do by having them meet at other times or dropping 10 to 20%. Have icebreakers to build trust and connection. Tony's idea that Gaston was sharing. When students are ready to interact, so they've already done some independent learning, you don't want students to show up and talk to one another and one student hasn't done any of the reading or learning. You want the TA or instructor to be present if expert guidance is needed. So if it's like a challenging activity, but you can also ask students to indicate when they will meet without the instructor present. If they're working on a group project, like what Amber was talking about, or I think maybe somebody else was also bringing up this idea of giving a group project. Al shared the group project idea. So this can help be a guide of when to make this synchronous stuff strategic.
Oh, I want to add something. So in my normal lab, I usually have pre-lab quizzes, and then they do the same quiz in lab when they show up, and they have to show up on time, otherwise they lose the points. Now I'm going to do that in the synchronous sessions. So basically they have to read the lab manual, do a pre-lab quiz. And then when they come to the synchronous session, we do a polling with the same questions.
Mm-hmm.
So then they can't just, they're responsible for being prepared coming into the section.
Right. And I think that's the nice thing about that, Gaston, is that then when they're working in small groups, the group isn't annoyed by somebody who wasn't really prepared. They're ready to interact and learn. Of course, in doing that, you also want to be flexible for the students who end up showing up late because of Wi-Fi, but I know that you're thinking about that, Gaston. Okay, so for the last bit of this webinar, and we're already getting feedback that we might need a deeper dive into equitable assessments. So this will just be an introduction and overview discussion to think about. Is we could do a whiteboard, but we can also do a chat or raise your hand. What challenges have you had with individual or proctored assessments this quarter if you've tried them? And if everything went smoothly, you can be like, nothing. My individual proctored assessments were fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Has anybody here tried individual proctored assessments this quarter? Oh, okay. What a group. Okay. Well, then I'll share. So I'll share considerations for doing this, but this is great. Lessons that we've learned from the spring. One thing is that the university as a whole has found that requiring students to turn on their camera to be watched or recorded poses privacy concerns. So they think that proctoring should not be undertaken lightly. You need to provide explicit notice to the students if you're going to use this thing called Respondus or Zoom proctoring. And instructors are encouraged to consider options that are more privacy protective when possible. And students should be notified at least a few weeks in advance to get a webcam if they need one. Just from individually talking to instructors and students, Respondus is this remote proctoring tool that at some point crashed during a student's exam. And she wasn't sure what to do because the instructor emailed them all to let them know it crashed, but they weren't supposed to check their emails. We had another instructor come in and say, what if my student's Wi-Fi dropped? Do I assume they're cheating? And then they had to have a whole protocol of what to do if their Wi-Fi dropped. And so the lessons we're learning is that when you're trying to do timed or remotely proctored exams, they're resulting in particularly high stress for students with issues, and in a lot of stress also for instructors trying to accommodate all these issues. What I'm learning from you all and your survey is that more than 80% of you are open to alternative forms of assessment. And I want to say for the 20% that are still like, I need to do individual proctored exams, we do still have a list of best practices for those. So I'm going to focus on the other ones, but want to make sure you know that we understand sometimes they're necessary. In moving to assessments this summer, we want to encourage you to cross this bridge from these traditional, often artificial assessments that we have in college to our more authentic and real world assessments that might be more collaborative, that might be more connecting students to their lives and connecting the content to their interests. So I'm going to share a few assessment strategies that were found to be more successful by UCLA faculty this quarter because I get to interact with a lot. Denise Chavira in psychology shifted the weight into frequent lower stakes quizzes on CCLE. So that's one technique so that students are less inclined to have academic dishonesty happen. Katsushi in physics and Aradna in EPSS both move towards projects, papers, or real world assessments where students could use Turnitin to make sure that they're not copying one another, but they were connecting things to their life and their interests and the content. Al, I know I was interacting with Al about his group projects, and so he was implementing some between group peer assessment with an instructor created rubric, and he got that actually from Tony. So you both are here, but yeah, Tony had a nice way of assessing presentations with this rubric. And then Jenny Casey from chemistry also used within group peer assessment. So she had people assess the behavior of their own group members as well. If you're doing a high stakes exam, then we consider add-ons to lower the stakes. So you can have a collaborative portion after the individual portion, which Jenny did, and Jeff Malloy did too. Or Jeff and Denise from psychology also ask students to share reasoning on their multiple choice responses. And this one I really like because we want our students to share their reasoning. And so at least it'll encourage students that even if they copied, my friend got B, so I'm going to put B, they need to share their own reasoning. And they know that you could always look at it if you wanted to. So I like that approach as well. There's an assessment checklist that I'll ask Jess or Rachel to put. Oh, whoa, look at that, Rachel. Rachel,
I was all ready.
I was ready too, but you didn't.
It's our third one. We're ready. But that'll walk you through all the ideas that I just gave, and it'll give you links and references and ideas for implementing them, including best practices if you're still doing individual remote tests. I want to end this webinar. This is almost your last activity, with a poll. And so I'm going to launch the polling. You'll see I made this a very generic poll, which just says, please answer the question on the slide. And the slide is, what assessments are you considering now? And so you can use something like this to have clicker-like questions in class, because you can relaunch this as many times as you want. Does everybody see the poll?
Is it multiple answer or?
It's multiple answer. Kristen's pointing out the poll blocks the slide. Can you not move the poll?
You can move it.
I can't figure out how.
Okay.
Just grab it at the top and move it.
You You can also exit full screen so that you can, right? If you don't have, I have more than one
Oh,
monitor.
now it's letting me move it. Okay. Apparently when I was full screen, it wasn't letting me.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This,
I just hit escape and now the poll went away.
Uh-oh. It's probably hidden.
yeah,
How do I get it back?
if you look down at your lower menu, can you click on
Yeah.
all the ones that say, that look like they have a Zoom icon? Would that help?
I clicked polling and now I got it, but they unchecked my boxes.
They unchecked your boxes, so you got to reach. This is.
I have to do it again.
Thank you for modeling what happens in every synchronous session, which is that there are always some students that it's not working for, and a lot of times it's because the instructor didn't think something through, but we're rolling with it just to count for the time. I'm going to end the polling just to show you the results, even if you didn't get to vote, just so you can see that when I share the results, you all can see the distribution. I can see a lot of you are thinking of shifting to quizzes, projects or papers, asking for reasoning, reducing grading time with group projects, honor code. I always like to put in H there as a test, like were you reading it? There is no H. But so that's an example of what you're thinking of. And then for the next steps to develop your course, we want to make sure you're aware we have these different checklists for remote teaching and assessment. And then Central UCLA Admin has a whole website that hopefully Rachel or Jess can share that lists events that are happening to support you in CCLE, Zoom, walk you through these different things to get you.
How do we get these checklists and these other materials?
The assessment checklist is in the chat right now. And then Rachel or Jess, could you add the remote teaching checklist?
Yeah.
And then the events calendar.
Will you post the recording of the chat as well as the?
We will, and we will email everyone who attended this with these same resources. So you'll get the slides, the checklist, this thing. That'll all come to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm now a minute over time. So I'm gonna officially end this, but let you know that there's this last Google Doc where you can write down remaining questions you have. You all are now part of a group that we want to have one-on-one consultations with to help with anything else, because you have the basic language that we all have. So we can schedule one-on-one consultations as you get ready for the summer. And we can have a deeper dive, for example, into assessment if we're hearing a lot of interest from that. And with that, I really want to thank you all for your engagement. We'll stick around in case you have other questions, but it's nice to meet you and see some of you again. Rachel?
We're available if you want one-on-one consultations. We're happy to meet with you, and so you can just let us know, send us an email, and we'll set up a time.
You guys had one of those documents was about teaching inclusively, and I'm not seeing it on your website.
So, Kristen, can you be one of the documents that we showed?
On the last slide, I think it was the top left one. I'm not seeing that on your website anywhere.
It might just be called remote teaching on our website. It's
called quickly moving to remote teaching.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. I do see it.
Yeah, we changed it to inclusive as soon as we add these 4 principles that are very informed by an inclusivity approach. That's why. Yeah, cool. Other
oh yeah, you've added a lot to it since the last time I looked at it. It's not as quick anymore.
It's not. We might have to take the quick part out. I think we did take the quick part out. It's an evolving document that we learn from all of you as we interact with faculty who are implementing it. Any of you who are sticking around, do you all have questions you want to ask us while you've got it?
Yeah, here's a dumb question. What group are you guys in?
We are center. Is that what you mean? The SEALs group?
Yeah, like I just saw this email and I clicked on it, but I have no idea who you guys are.
We are a center in the life sciences division and physical science. We're supported by life and physical sciences. And we are a team. This is our team. And our mission is really to support inclusive teaching practices and transform the way we teach in STEM at UCLA. And so we work with faculty, we work with grad students and postdocs. Shauna and I both teach an undergrad class. And so we kind of come at it from all different angles. But we are supported by the Deans of Life and Physical Science, and we are a center that we've been around now for 5 years.
Nice. I never knew about you guys.
Here we are.
Huh.
Have you checked out our website?
Nope.
I just posted it in there, seals.ucla.edu.
Yeah. So we have all kinds of resources on the website, including teaching guides and the programs that we run and events that we have. And so.
And you know what, Scott, you were in my group and you were saying you were a little nervous about the technology aspect.
Yes.
We do have we have kind of a little army of undergrad learning assistants that are both available at hours we're not always available to walk folks through the technology, and that can be available if you want during some of your first Zoom sessions or other ones to help like troubleshoot as things happen. So
that would be very helpful. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, well.
In fact, this was just a really good webinar. You packed it with lots of very valuable information and modeled what you're talking about.
Thank you. Feel free to tell the deans that. No.
Yeah.
I hope we're still recording and we got that.
Any other questions? Anybody else want to tell us how wonderful we are? I know.
I think it went really well too.
Okay.
And I was glad to find out that I actually am already doing a lot of these things. So I was happy.
Yeah, Kristen, I'm
Definitely
not
more.
You're very thoughtful. But no, any other questions from anyone?
I have a question for Shauna, but not since you're here.
Okay, we'll wait till everyone leaves, guys.
Yeah.
Bye, Andrew. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to
Thank you.
pop off
Thanks very
also,
much.
but it was
No,
great to
thank
see
you.
everyone and contact us if you need help.
I'm going to pop off too.
Okay.
Bye, Rachel.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.